Chapter 12. Losing all feelings in his legs, Arturo's knees buckled, and he fell to the floor like a limp sack of flour. Gasping for air, Sophia covered her mouth and gazed in astonishment at her sister-in-law. Breaking down into a sobbing fit, Valera buried her face in her hands, holding a corner of her skirt. Darting her eyes over to her husband, Sophia saw Hernan sitting before the fire with his eyes transfixed. Through the years, Sophia had always known her husband to have the countenance of steel. The ability to handle difficult moments was one of his strengths. But even this was too much for him to bear. One tear started to form in each of Hernan's eyes, then more. Before the night would finish, many more would be spilled. "Why?" pled Arturo, with the broken screams of a heart-stricken man. Dragging in another breath, he begged, "How did this happen?" He was barely able to get the words out of his mouth. Breathing in short bursts, Valera answered, "When I was shopping for dinner that evening, I noticed a man coming into town on a horse. Over its hindquarters was draped a blue banner with the crest of an eagle and a lion locked in battle." Immediately Hernan and Arturo recognized the crest as belonging to the Bandian traders, the group their father had been aligned with for the last several years. "Naturally," Valera continued while looking intently at her husband, "I walked over to him to inquire about Diego and whether he knew when Diego would be returning home to visit his children. I thought it would be nice if he could come home, since he had no knowledge of his grandson, Joselito. When I walked up to the man, he identified himself as the second-in-command of the Bandiani, and said he was in town to find the Barragoni Cisneros family. My heart leaped, since I was sure he was about to tell me Diego was arriving shortly." Valera dropped her eyes to the floor once more and continued relating the events of that day. "When I told him he had already found the family by talking to me," said Valera, "he proceeded to tell me the bad news. He said Diego was firmly convinced the route they normally took to get to the Orient was longer than needed, and he thought he could find a more direct route east. The leader of the Bandiani granted Diego permission to explore a new route east and gave him a group of men to command during the expedition. The man told me of how Diego actually found a faster route to India, but apparently a large group of marauders met up with his party in the foothills of Arabia. Not being one to back down when assaulted," Valera paused, "Diego was killed in Arabia, where he is now buried. Some of the men he was commanding were able to escape and relate the story to the leader of the Bandiani. He said the Bandian traders decided to use that new route, but only under heavy guard. After talking to me, he said he was satisfied he had notified the family, and he left the city." Sensing she was somehow deviating, Valera regained her verbal bearing and continued, "When I heard this news, I was shocked, of course, but later I began to fear how you and your brother were going to react." She looked up from the spot on the floor where she had been staring, and searched for the face of her husband. He had his face buried in his arm, which was lying across his knees. Arturo was a crumpled mass of humanity. His very life had been drained, and his countenance had shifted from happiness to pain in a matter of seconds. "I wanted to tell you before this, but I couldn't. I just couldn't." Not able to take the thick and ever-increasing air of depression in the room, Valera jumped up and ran out the door to the well-groomed courtyard in front of the house. Sophia quickly followed her, and Joselito, not sure whether he should go, followed the women, since it made him very insecure to know his mother was so upset. After what seemed an eternity, Arturo looked up and saw his brother leaning back in his chair with his eyes closed. If it were not for Hernan's lips moving in silent prayer, Arturo would have thought his brother was sleeping. Prayer. Now that was a good idea. Hernan always seemed to be the first one to think of such things, even though both of them had a great and reverential fear of the Almighty. Getting up from his position on the floor and moving closer to the fireplace where his brother was, Arturo sat down beside him and was the first to break the silence.
That damned old man. Why did he have to be so fearless and headstrong?
Hernan paused for a moment, long enough for Arturo to think his question wouldn't be answered, not that he was looking for a response. Then Hernan spoke up and said, "To answer that question, my brother, you only need to look as far as the mirror on the wall." Arturo knew exactly what Hernan was saying. They both were just as headstrong as their father, and they both were very determined to get what they wanted. Usually that meant good things to those around them, since Hernan and Arturo were good men who didn't take advantage of their fellow man. As if to scold his now-dead father, Arturo rhetorically asked, "How many times did we tell you to be careful? How many times did I tell you your life was more valuable than the riches of the East?" After contemplating the questions, the brothers knew there were no answers for them. Given the same circumstances, they probably would have made the same decisions. After all, the man needed to get away from all the painful memories of the farm, didn't he? He needed the diversion, right? Always more analytical than his brother, Hernan spoke up. "Actually, the most important thing to remember is our father was finally happy again. Remember the stories he told us when he visited last time? You and I both saw that old fire in his eyes again. We hadn't seen it since Mother died. Speaking for myself, I enjoyed seeing that fire again." Arturo paused for a moment and thought about a letter he had received from his father, which said in part,
"Sometimes, my son, I think about the life I had with my wife and my children. I remember smelling the fragrance of Maria's hair, feeling the warm and loving touch of her embrace. I remember the way she was able to look me in the eyes and gaze beyond, as if she was able to fondle the innermost parts of my soul. It is when I see other men with their wives that I feel the greatest loss. How I wish I could once again feel her silken skin against mine, or feel the breath of a woman whose essence was so tightly bound with mine. I have had opportunities to enjoy the carnal love of another woman, but none could ever compare to Maria, so my answer was always no. She was my heart. She was my soul. She was my life. I feel it is a good thing I'm with the Bandiani, since this is a troop of men. I have little opportunity to allow my thoughts to wander back to my life with Maria, and so, in a way, life is easier. In fact, my life now is rewarding and prosperous. I have purpose again, and feel like life is once again worth living."
"Well, my brother," said Arturo, "I know he was happy with his new life and with what he was doing. I just can't believe he's gone. I just can't believe—" "I know," injected Hernan. "It seems there is little left for him to have as his legacy. Nothing lasting to assign to his honor. Nothing." Arturo nodded. Both brothers sat in a warm room filled with cold emptiness. After regaining some composure outside, Sofia and Valero returned inside with Joselito, and proceeded to prepare dinner. There wasn't much conversation at the dinner table, and little Joselito knew, even though he was only 4 years old, he should stay quiet. There were the usual pleasantries, pass this, or please serve me some of that. But they all felt an underlying tension. Just when it seemed the entire dinner would be marked by a deafening silence, Arturo pointedly dropped his fork and said, "Our father deserves more than this. He deserves to be remembered honorably, and not as a hapless traitor who let marauders get the best of him." Looking up from his half-eaten cold dinner, Hernan asked, "What are you saying?" Sitting back in his chair and placing his arms at his side, Arturo replied, "I'm just saying his memory should continue. You and I both know how good a man he is." He looked down at his plate, recognizing his error. "I mean, was." Swallowing what felt like his heart throbbing in his throat, Arturo continued, "But he deserves more. He just deserves more." "I agree with you, my brother. But what can we do for him now that he is gone?" Hernan couldn't bring himself to say dead. Getting up from the table, Arturo contemplatively looked up and slowly strode to the fireplace. He began stroking his chin as his eyes came to rest on the rock sitting on the mantel. Hernan recognized this look, a look Arturo always put on when he was about to come up with an idea.
"Felipe wants to sell both of his ships, doesn't he?"
Instantly, Hernan knew what his brother was thinking. "You want to find a new trading route by sailing to the Orient instead of traveling overland, don't you?" he asked. This actually wasn't a new idea for the two brothers. On many occasions they had discussed it, and even made a pact when they were young that, if ever possible, they would make such a voyage. Ever since the day they first saw the sea, after being rescued by the Gitanos, the young boys repeatedly had long conversations with anyone they could find who had ever been on the sea. It was this early fascination with the sea, as well as the determination to sail around the world one day, that led to Hernan and Arturo being sailors for many years. Normally, Hernan would be hesitant at the thought of adopting another one of his brother's ideas. Whenever he did, he usually got in trouble. This time was different, though. Feeling just as much passion as his brother about the legacy of his father, as well as smarting from the fresh wound this devastating news caused, Hernan was more than willing to accept the idea.
"Yes," responded Arturo. "We will dedicate this voyage to the memory of our father. Once we establish the route, we will name it after him. How many times have we talked about it? And how many—"
"I'll do it," interrupted Hernan. The gravity of the decision just made hung heavily in the air, like an early morning mist covering a seaside village. Sophia and Valera sat stunned and silent, not knowing what, if anything, could be said. They were horrified at the prospect of their husbands going off on a sailing expedition from which they might not return. What could be said? Anything? No, not a word. They both knew once a decision had been made, there was no changing that decision. Once more, Hernan and Arturo were going to sea. Hey, fellow Galimarians, this is Dan Adrian, and I just wanted to say thank you for listening to my book. If you can, please click like down below because it really helps me bring these videos to you and lets me know what you like. Also, if you haven't already, please subscribe and click on the bell so that you'll get notified when I release more chapters. If you have any questions about this or any other of my books, or if you want to know more about what it takes to write a novel like this one, please make sure you leave your question in the comments below. Thanks again. I'll see you soon.